All right, let's rock out some music history. Oh, prove up bass!
Welcome back to Music History with Joey. I'm your host, Joey, and tonight we're getting our hands a little dirty. Pull up a stool, grab a cold one, and let me paint a picture for you. The year is 1979. If you were a rock fan, 1979 was a weird, confusing, and frankly kind of terrifying time to be alive. The music industry was having a massive, very public identity crisis. On one hand, you had disco. The Bee Gees were practically printing their own money. People were wearing polyester suits, doing the hustle, and Studio 54 was the center of the universe. It got so bad in July of '79, rock fans rioted at Comiskey Park in Chicago during Disco Demolition Night, literally blowing up crates of disco records on the baseball field. People were pissed. On the other extreme, you had punk rock. The Sex Pistols had already come and gone, leaving a scorched mark on the earth. And bands like The Clash and the Ramones were telling everyone that if you knew more than 3 chords, you were a sellout. Punk was raw, it was angry, and it was held together by safety pins and spit. And then, stuck right smack in the middle of this musical war zone, driving a very expensive, freshly detailed sports car, was Foreigner. If you looked at the charts in the late 70s, Foreigner owned them. They had dropped their self-titled debut in '77 and Double Vision in '78. They were absolute monsters of the FM dial. They were selling out arenas before they even had enough songs to fill a 2-hour set list. But there was a problem, a big one. The critics absolutely, unequivocally hated them. The music press, your Rolling Stones, your Cream magazines, they looked at Foreigner and saw the enemy. They coined the term corporate rock specifically for bands like Boston and Journey. They accused them of being too polished, too calculating, too perfect. They basically treated Foreigner like McDonald's of rock and roll, efficiently produced, aggressively marketed, and completely devoid of any real street level soul. Mick Jones? Yeah, that guy, the mastermind, lead guitarist, and primary songwriter of Foreigner, took that personally, and frankly, he had a right to. But he knew that to survive the shifting tides of the late 70s, the band couldn't just put out another Double Vision Part 2. They couldn't be the guys in the pristine silk shirts anymore. They needed to prove they could bleed. They needed to get some grease under their fingernails. And that desperate, angry need to prove the critics wrong resulted in a track that sounded like a bar fight in a New Jersey alleyway. A track that made every suburban mom clutch her pearls while her teenage son cranked the stereo and practiced his air guitar. We're talking about the lead single off the Head Games album. We're talking about Dirty White Boy. Now, before we can dig into the dirt of this song, you have to understand the DNA of Foreigner, because the irony of Dirty White Boy is that it was written by a guy who was the furthest thing from a dirty white boy. Mick Jones? Yeah, that guy was a highly refined, well-traveled British musician. Before Foreigner, he was a hired gun. He played with Gary Wright of Dreamweaver fame. He even spent years in France playing the guitar for the French rock icon Johnny Hallyday. We're talking about a guy who knew his way around fine wine and expensive studios. But Mick had this incredibly brilliant, aggressive rock edge to his writing. He knew he couldn't sing it himself. He needed a voice. He needed a guy who sounded like he actually worked for a living. Enter Lou Gramm. If Mick Jones was the slick British architect, Lou Gramm was the upstate New York sledgehammer. Lou was from Rochester. He was in a band called Black Sheep, who were actually pretty heavy bluesy rock band. Black Sheep had opened for Kiss and they were gaining some traction until their equipment truck crashed on the ice, essentially bankrupting the band. Mick Jones had heard a Black Sheep record, tracked Lou down and flew him out to audition. That combination, Mick's razor-sharp British songcraft and Lou's blue-collar gravel road American voice, is what made Foreigner unstoppable. But by 79, Lou was getting tired of singing power ballads. He was a rock singer, not a crooner, and Mick was tired of being called a corporate sellout. So when they started writing for their third album, Head Games, Mick had a specific phrase rattling in his head, a phrase that he actually lifted from watching a completely different music icon. The inspiration for Dirty White Boy, believe it or not, came from the king of rock and roll himself, Elvis Presley. Mick Jones has said in interviews that he was fascinated by Elvis, specifically late era Elvis. Now, a lot of people just saw the rhinestones, the sideburns, and the Las Vegas spectacle. But Mick saw beneath the jumpsuits. He remembered the original Elvis, the dangerous, hip-shaking rebel who terrified parents in the 1950s. Mick saw how that raw, rebellious nature had curdled into something tragic, but still American. Mick wanted to write a character study. He wanted to write about an outsider, a guy who completely rejected the polished, disco glitter perfection of 1979. He didn't want to write about love or cold as ice women or being a jukebox hero. Not yet, anyway. He wanted a song about a guy you would cross the street to avoid. He pitched the title to Lou, and Lou probably knew a few actual dirty white boys growing up in Rochester, was all in. Now, I love this song. You guys know me. I'm a hard rock guy through and through. Just last week we were talking about Billy Squier's Emotions in Motion, which, by the way, came out in 82, not 81, and I still stand by that. But I have to be honest with you about the lyrics to Dirty White Boy. If you actually sit down and read them on paper, they're kind of hilarious. Mick Jones is trying his absolute hardest to sound like a tough guy, and it results in some of the most beautifully clunky poetry rock history. Let's break down the verse. Mick writes, "I've been in trouble since I don't know when. I'm in trouble now and I'll somehow find trouble again."
I've been in trouble since I don't know when. I'm in trouble now and I know somehow I'll find trouble again.
Hold on. Stop the tape. Nothing says rebel outsider and dangerous street tough quite like don't drive no big black car, don't like no Hollywood movie star.
Don't drive no big black car. Don't like no Hollywood movie star.
It's such a weird flex, man. If a guy pulls a knife on you in an alley and brags about that, you're going to... and not hand over your wallet. But in late 70s British rock slang, Mick was trying to say that the character's right in the thick of the action. He's not watching from the sidewalk. He's out in the middle of the street taking his hits. But here's the absolute undisputed truth about rock and roll. The lyrics don't matter if the delivery is lethal. And Lou Gramm's delivery on this track is a weapon of mass destruction. Now, if I sang those words, I'd sound like an idiot reading an instruction manual for a snowblower. But Lou Gramm brings his intense, venomous grit to every single syllable. He pushes his voice to the absolute breaking point. There are moments in the second verse where his voice actually cracks, and they keep it in the final mix because it sounds so raw.
Well, I'm a dirty white boy. 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 Dirty white boy.
When Lou Gramm screams, "Hey, I'm a dirty white boy," you believe him. You forget that he's a millionaire rock star. You believe he's a guy sitting on the hood of a rusted out Camaro, smoking a Lucky Strike, waiting for a fight. He grounds the entire song and sells the persona. And that's the magic of Lou Gramm. He was the anchor. No matter how big the production got, Lou always sounded like a real guy. Now let's talk about that production. Listen to the snare drum. It hits like a cinder block being dropped from a 2-story window onto a sheet of plywood. To get that massive, heavy, aggressive sound, Foreigner brought in a producer who was practically a god in the 70s. His name was Roy Thomas Baker. Now, if you know your rock history, you know that Roy Thomas Baker is the guy who produced Queen's A Night at the Opera. He is the mad scientist who engineered Bohemian Rhapsody. The man loved layers. He loved theatrical drama. If you wanted a choir of 100 voices layered over 12 blazing guitar solos, Roy was your guy. He made things sound expensive, lush, and huge. So what does Mick Jones do? Well, he hires the guy and tells him, "I want us to sound like we're playing in a filthy club with bad wiring." It was a brilliant contradiction. Baker took Foreigner's massive arena sound and basically put it in a vice grip. He compressed the living daylights out of it. Now let's talk about that opening riff again. The notes are incredibly simple. It's built around a G, a C, and a D chord. Any kid who gets a Stratocaster for Christmas could learn to play the notes of Dirty White Boy by New Year's Eve. But it's the tone that makes it a monster. Listen to it closely next time you're cruising down the strip with the windows down. There's almost zero reverb on the guitar. Usually in the 70s, producers bathed guitars in reverbs to make them sound like they were echoing through a stadium, but not here. This guitar tone is bone dry. It's a pure, overdriven Marshall amplifier pushed right up against the microphone. It sounds like the amp is sitting in the passenger seat next to you. It's Foreigner's way of kicking in the door and saying, hey, you think we're soft? We can hang with the heavy hitters. They even dropped the tuning of the guitars down a half step to E flat. A lot of bands do this. Van Halen did it constantly. Metallica does it. It loosens the strings, making the guitar sound thicker, heavier, and a little more ominous. It also is slightly easier for the singer to hit those screeching high notes, which Lou Gramm was absolutely destroying his vocal cords trying to reach.
Well, I'm a dirty white boy. 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 Dirty white boy.
Mick Jones isn't trying to be Eddie Van Halen. He's not playing a million miles an hour. He plays a sleazy blues-based solo with heavy vibrato. He bends the strings like they owe him money. Everything about the track is designed to punch you right in the chest. But of course you can't talk about the song without talking about the visual stunt that came with it. Because Foreigner wasn't just changing their sound, they were trying to change their entire public image. And that leads us to the album cover for Head Games. If you're around in 79, you remember this cover. You couldn't miss it in the record store. It featured a young woman played by actress Liz Ann Falk, who later starred in Heathers, if you didn't know. Standing in a men's restroom, she looked totally distressed, looking over her shoulder like she's been caught while she tries to wipe some graffiti off a urinal. Man, people lost their absolute minds over that. You have to remember, 1979 was a time of huge cultural shifts. Feminist groups saw the cover and protest outside Atlantic Records. Record stores in the Midwest flat out refused to carry the album, or they kept it behind the counter in a brown paper sleeve, like it was contraband. Critics called it exploitive, tasteless, and aggressively weird. But here's the kicker. It was brilliant marketing. It was peak bad boy behavior. Mick Jones and the record label knew exactly what they were doing. They actively poked the bear. They wanted the controversy. They wanted the parents to hate it because nothing kills a corporate rock label faster than being banned from a shopping mall. And did it work? Well, you tell me. The album Head Games went on to sell over 5 million copies in the US alone. Dirty White Boy climbed to number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100. It turns out causing a scene and getting your hands a little dirty is phenomenal for business. So where does Dirty White Boy stand in the grand scheme of rock history? Why are we talking about it nearly 50 years later? Because it was the bridge. Without Dirty White Boy, Foreigner doesn't get to become the undisputed kings of 80s rock. They needed to prove they could play in the mud before they could release an untouchable masterpiece like 4 in 1981. They needed to shed the 70s classic rock baggage. But more importantly, it laid the groundwork for an entire decade of music. It injected arena rock with a sleazy, aggressive attitude that paved the way for the heavier bands that were waiting in the wings. Without the attitude of Dirty White Boy, do we get the Sunset Strip scene? Do we get Motley Crue Shout at the Devil in exactly the same way? It showed that you could be massive, you could have a hit on the radio, and you could still sound dangerous. It's under 4 minutes long, it doesn't overstay its welcome, and it is the ultimate main character track. Because whether you're a multi-platinum rock star living in a mansion or just a guy working a 9-to-5 trying to survive week to week, when that chorus hits, you get to be the tough guy for 3 minutes and 42 seconds. You are the rebel. And that, my friends, is the power of rock and roll. A simple riff, a screaming vocal, enough attitude to burn down the building. That's all the time we got for tonight's deep dive. Next time you hear that riff kick off on the radio, turn it up, roll the windows down, and just remember, Mick Jones wanted you to think that he was a rebel, even if he was probably sipping an imported Earl Grey tea while he wrote it. I'm Joey Morgan, and this has been Music History with Joey. Keep your vinyl clean, stay loud, keep it sexy, and keep it rocking. Peace.
Come on, boy. Stay right, boy.